Thanks, Tianka. And I want to thank the NDIA in general, and especially Angela, Laura, all of the people who worked so hard on organizing this wonderful conference. I want to thank you all for being here and for this opportunity to talk to you, to an audience that's doing important work in your communities. But you know that work is making a difference, but you often don't have a systematic way to show how that's making a difference. So I want to share with you some of the research, adjusting this for my height here, share with you some of the research that I'm doing with my colleague Carolyn Tolbert at the University of Iowa, who I've collaborated with for a long time, and one of her students, a doctoral student, Scott Lacombe, and it's for a book project where we want to look at technology and opportunity at different geographic scales. So, without further ado, okay. So, I won't need to spend a long time on this first slide because I'm speaking to the choir here. Why digital inclusion matters. You're all from governments and nonprofits, libraries, other community institutions here that promote digital inclusion because you believe that it's important both for the individuals in your community and for society. So broadband is a public good, we know, with spillover benefits for communities and society. Again, we haven't always been able to measure those, but you know, it's important to look at broadband use, which is and not just infrastructure, which I'm going to do today. I'm looking at broadband adoption. And my colleagues and I, Carolyn Tolbert and I, have argued that technology use is really about the ability to participate in society online. We call that digital citizenship because, like citizenship, it means belonging and participation in society. It means it means having the capacities and the skills to be fully a citizen in a society and to have equality of opportunity. So there's, I think I skipped a slide. So just quickly, you know, the way that we've defined digital citizenship has been having regular access to the internet and to be able to use it effectively. So that means not only access to broadband with appropriate speeds and to a range of devices, but to have the skills to use technology, not just technical skills, but information literacy. And so one way that we've measured that is the activities that people have that they perform online, the range of activities online, and have tried to look at what are the benefits that come from those specific activities as well as broadband adoption. So there's been better evidence on how that matters for individuals and less evidence on how that matters for communities. And one reason is the kind of data that we have. Until recently, there hasn't been good community data, good community level data. There's some, but it's been harder to get. So we focused on, you know, this idea of citizenship, that it's about economic opportunity and also about democratic participation. And not only my colleagues and I, but a lot of researchers have shown that internet use, technology use, has benefits for wages, including for less educated workers. And they've talked about it in terms of human capital, that, you know, activities online can help promote education and health and all kinds of economic outcomes for individuals, that it builds human capital. And we've also, I'm a political scientist by training, we've also looked at civic engagement, democratic participation, civic knowledge. There's actually a huge literature, not only here in the US, but in many countries, showing that there are a lot of effects for democratic participation and for access to government services, and how this matters about citizen attitudes about government, including trust and confidence in government. So that's all at the individual level. But we also know that, that it's important to look at broadband, as we're going to hear in a moment, and not to look at just internet use more generally, because there are differences in terms of what people can do online because of how they're connected or the devices that they have. So in low-income communities, and especially mobile-only use is increasingly common. We've talked about people as being internet users, but less connected internet users. And we know that being mobile-only matters for activities online. So in a way, it's a step forward. People have personal access. But we also know from research that we've done, Pew and others have done, that people who are mobile-only users do less online than broadband users. And remember, digital citizenship is about activities online and participating online. We found in some research on Chicago in low-income neighborhoods that actually African American and Latino mobile-only users do more on their phone, including these political and economic activities, because it's what they have, but they still do less than people who have broadband at home. So even with changes in technology, it's really important to look at broadband adoption at home as a measure of use and digital citizenship, and to understand how that matters for not only for individuals, but community benefits. So, there is some research on community outcomes, and in terms of broadband, it's generally been research on how deployment or broadband infrastructure matters. For one reason, there's been some data from the Federal Communications Commission on this, and there are a number of problems with the data too, but apart from that, there has been something that people could look at at a community level, tract level. And so research has shown that for this deployment, there are positive effects in many studies. There's pretty broad consensus that there are positive effects for things like local employment, wages, business investment at the local level. Some studies have shown that the benefits, so Kolko in 2010 had a study of California where he found more benefits for businesses, for business investment, but that residents didn't necessarily get jobs or wages. So there are different economic benefits, and some of them go more to residents, others to businesses, but kind of a consensus on this for infrastructure. But that's not the same as whether people in the community, including businesses, small businesses, but residents, whether they're actually using technology, because as you all know, affordability, lack of skill, there are all kinds of things that affect whether broadband's actually being adopted and used. So we need to look at this and not just the presence of infrastructure. And we know now that we have data from the American Community Survey, looking at counties. This is some recent data, Douglas County with 95% in Colorado who have broadband at home versus Apache County in my state of Arizona with 39%. That reflects urban or suburban and rural differences, but even for cities where there's infrastructure, Sunnyvale, California, and Silicon Valley, nearly twice as much as Flint, not quite, but almost twice as much as Flint, Michigan. And of course, that reflects differences in income and other factors in these communities. So now that we have this American Community Survey data, we can see how broadband adoption varies across the country. This is a county, this is aggregated up to the county, and darker blue means more broadband adoption, but we can see that there's this variation across communities and that a lot of this is regional too. There are lighter, much lighter sections of the country. And even some of those places that looked dark blue in the map before, if we look at the zip code level, which is generally below county level, we can see even more variation. Again, you know, not everybody has broadband at home. There are lots of differences across communities. So this has been a missing piece of the puzzle, having data on broadband adoption at the community level. And while this is getting better, there's this new data from the American Community Survey. It only began to be collected in 2013. That's only a few years ago. And really this census tract level data only came out in December 2018. Before this, it was only available for communities with 65,000 plus in the population. That meant that we were missing about 3/4 of the counties, and many of those rural counties. You know, even before December, there were only 820 of the over 3,000 counties in the US. We only had data on larger cities, really, as well as larger counties. There was no neighborhood level data. So what was available, in addition to the American Community Survey, is some data from the Federal Communications Commission, which was available over a longer time period. But the problem is it only measured broadband adoption in quintiles, these categories of 0 to 20%, 20 to 40%, 40 to 60%. So that's not a very good measure of the variation across these communities or a measure of change. We want to track change and how changes in broadband adoption matter for economic outcomes. So this made this difficult to do. However, even using this limited Federal Communications Commission data, there's a study that really kind of captured my imagination as I was going through the literature. I don't know, I think Roberto Gallardo has been here at the conference. He's one of the co-authors on this. There's one study, Whitaker, Gallardo, and Strover, that had done a study of rural counties and used this FCC data. They compared the deployment data with this quintile data, this kind of rough categorical data on adoption. And even so, they found that while both mattered for a number of economic outcomes for these communities, and it was just rural counties, that the broadband adoption measures, as bad as the data was, mattered more, that it had a stronger impact. So this poses all kinds of really interesting questions. If we have better data, you know, what about metropolitan areas too? What about all communities, all counties, not just rural ones? You know, and even looking at rural ones, would this hold up with more precise data? So I want to talk for a minute about why community level outcomes matter. You understand this, of course, at a grassroots level, but I want to talk about it a little bit in the national conversation today, our debates over policy. So first of all, the US is a collection of regional economies. It was mentioned I teach local government, so I'm kind of going into a real short lesson here. It's not one economy, but a bunch of regional economies that differ from each other. After World War II, we saw for a long time that wage gaps and inequality across communities was narrowing. But since the 1980s, we've seen this inequality widening. And this is part of a larger discussion about structural change in the economy, that there's this there's a consensus, there's a growing inequality across communities. And that started before the recession. It accelerated with the downturn, but even with the recovery, it's been continuing, this pulling apart. And so a lot of scholars, others are calling this a historic change in opportunity across places. There's a lot of discussion about places and people who are left behind. In research, so some researchers, think tanks, scholars, others are talking about the great divergence, winner-take-all urbanism, the big sort, the great reshuffling. So this is very much on the policy agenda now. Some of you may be familiar with Raj Chetty's work about how place matters for opportunity. He and Hendra and some of his colleagues have done some work showing that down to the neighborhood level, county, but even down to the neighborhood level, where children grow up affects their economic opportunity and intergenerational mobility when they're in their 30s. So years later, this has a lifelong impact, the opportunities that kids have in their neighborhoods when they grow up. And so that's some of this. So in this graph here, Chetty is on the right-hand side. You can see from 1940 to 1980, this line that's falling down rapidly, and this is intergenerational mobility that's been in decline since the 40s. And Chetty makes the argument this is because of the place-based opportunities that people have in their communities. We can see on the left there's this kind of flat line that's growth in income for the bottom 50% of US wage earners. That's been flat, pretty much flat since the 60s. So we can see, how community level opportunity matters, but especially for opportunity for lower wage workers, for lower income communities. Again, this is on the policy agenda. You can see in blogs and think tank reports and the media, this idea of the growing inequality, and also technology's role in it. And technology has played a role in changing the landscape and changing opportunity in some ways that are not necessarily positive. So it's increased the premium for education and skill. This actually is positive in terms of adding to innovation in the economy. This is what economists call skill-biased technical change, skill-biased change, rather, in the economy. And one of the arguments made that I'll come back to, Moretti, who's an economist, has said, this is the human capital century. What matters is ideas and human capital and the skills that people have. So tech firms, we see this concentration in places with skilled workforces. There are a lot of reasons for this, knowledge spillovers across firms, but part of this growing inequality is the concentration of more economic activity in what's been called ecosystems of innovation, or kind of the brain hubs. And technology has concentrated this activity more than industry, during other industries like manufacturing. Instead of what you would say, the placelessness about technology or the death of distance, ironically, in some ways, it's concentrated activity more in these innovation hubs, and place matters more than even in the past. But what we want to ask, my colleagues and I, is does broadband use, does technology, one way of looking at technology or measuring it, does it actually offer some solutions for communities? So we know that growth and productivity at the national level result from more than just investments in information technology firms or employment in these firms. We know that it really results from the application of technology throughout all kinds of occupations and sectors. Again, even for lower, less educated workers, for all kinds of jobs. So what if we took a look at how technology matters throughout the economy, a local economy? Does widespread adoption create positive spillovers for the community? Does it mean that people in that community have more access to information about jobs and education and opportunities? Does it mean that people have skills, these digital skills? That's a kind of digital human capital. We also know that there's something that economists call network externalities. This is just that idea of spillovers. And so the idea is, it's sometimes called a network effect. As more people participate in the network, that the benefits generated, the social benefits generated by that network grow with more participants. It's more valuable the more people are in the network. So does greater digital inclusion within a community, does it have these kind of network benefits or network externalities? Broadband adoption, it's a measure of actual use of technology. Is it related to community prosperity and opportunity? So a lot of policy assumes that this is so. On the right-hand side, the National Broadband Plan. On the left-hand side, some of the recent policies of the USDA on rural prosperity. A lot of our policy assumes this. But again, we haven't had really great research on this. One reason is the need for reliable data over time. And I talked about how we don't have data for very long, just over a few years. There's a reason why this is important, to be able to look for a number of years over time. So if we see that broadband use is related to income in a community, the question is, does this mean that broadband use caused the higher income in the community? We know income affects adoption, right? So it could also just be that better off, more affluent communities, because they're more affluent, they have higher levels of broadband adoption. We need to figure out some way to get past that. We need to be able to say what causes what came first. So if we use data over time, what's called time series analysis, that's the gold standard in this kind of research. We can look at whether a change in broadband adoption in 1 year, does that result in changes in things like income or employment subsequent to that in later years. So that takes care of the what came first. And so that helps us to get at what caused what. And that's the really hard part about this research. So we have some data over time that Carolyn especially, been the statistician doing this, that we, in our Digital Cities book in 2012, we looked at we did some models to take data from the current population survey, some samples from the 50 largest metros, and there was enough there to model that and come up with estimates, and we've expanded on that. So in 2015, we put up a broadband data portal. We had a National Science Foundation grant that gave us some funds to estimate from this current population survey, which is also from the census. It has usually over 50,000 households, about 100,000 or so individuals answering it. It's smaller than what the census is using now, the American Community Survey, but with some statistical modeling, multi-level modeling, I won't go into that, we can still estimate for broadband use since 2000 for the 50 largest metros and their principal cities, a little over like 320 largest counties. And we've added to that as the American Community Survey data began to come out in 2013, we've used that. But before that, we used these estimates from the current population survey. You can just kind of see some patterns over time. I'm not going to dwell on that. If you're interested later, the top metros by 2012, this is from the data, the estimates we created ourselves, and they read like percentages. By the way, Portland, where you're going to be next year, they're at the top here, but Portland, Boston, Seattle, San Diego, probably you could guess which metros are where, and some of these metros have changed over time, some of the bottom metros, but we're looking at the 50, we don't need this one. We're looking at the 50 top metros. The question we want to look at then is, does broadband adoption create spillover benefits over time across different geographies? And we're still developing this book, but so far we've looked at the 50 largest metros and 320 largest counties. Metros are regional economies, as I mentioned. They've been written about as really the drivers of innovation in the economy, especially the largest metros, the kind that we're looking at. They're regional labor markets. There is some research that says advanced uses by businesses it matters in metropolitan areas, but it only leads to higher wages in this business firm research in like the 6% of largest metros that also have a lot of technology investment. But nobody's looked at broadband use in the population. We're asking, does this matter for a community score on prosperity or growth? And I'll show you what that means in a minute. We're taking some measures that have been tracked by the Brookings Institution in their Metro Monitor. They've been generous in sharing this data with us. Again, looking from 2000 to 2016 for these largest metros. We're controlling for other factors we know that likely affect economic outcomes like education, employment, whether someone's employed or not, household median income, race, ethnicity, age distribution, employment by industry, the NAICS codes. We're controlling for this at the community level. And we're also looking at what we call interaction terms, and simply what this means is, in addition to looking at how broadband over time matters, we're asking whether broadband combined with IT employment in the community, whether that matters, not just controlling for it, but maybe the combination makes a difference. We're asking whether the combination between broadband and millennials in the population. There's been some work Brookings and others have done showing that, along with technology, this matters for community prosperity, the share of the workforce or millennials. And then we're looking at, interactions with household median income. So I mentioned the Brookings Metro Monitor. Prosperity, they're measuring in terms of changes in the average wage, changes in productivity, and in standard of living in the community. So that's really benefits for residents more. The idea of prosperity is more how residents benefit, like from higher wages. Growth is more business benefits or economic growth, changes in the gross metropolitan and product, number of jobs, newer firms, so those are the two ideas. One's more business investment and growth, and the other's resident benefits. So our results. Gosh, it's hard for me to see that far away. I'm going to turn. So we have these two indices. There's the prosperity index and the growth index. In terms of prosperity, broadband lag, that means broadband over time, is significant and positive. So just looking at broadband adoption alone, that's a predictor of, over time, having higher scores on this prosperity index. Just broadband alone. But we also see, I mentioned these interaction terms. For two of them, broadband plus, broadband being combined with IT employment in the community. That's significant too. So that means that kind of expands the effect of broadband. It intensifies it. And also broadband times the share of millennials in the population is also related to changes in this prosperity index. So those factors that have been identified in some of the research before still do matter in combination with broadband, but they kind of amplify each other. But broadband alone, broadband adoption alone, matters for prosperity. It does not directly alone matter for changes in the growth index in the metro work that we did, in the way that it gets measured by Brookings. But if we look at the interaction terms, it's the combination of broadband, levels of broadband use along with the employment in IT, and combination of broadband use with millennials in the workforce, in the share of the population more generally. This does matter for the growth measures that we're looking at. So overall, the implications is broadband adoption is a stronger predictor for prosperity. That's benefits for residents. That's kind of in contrast with what Kolko found in his study. And there's variation across places and time. But the interactions show that prosperity is also stronger where there's an IT sector that's strong, and millennials in the population. Growth, again, there's no direct relationship, but those interaction terms, when it's combined with the presence of the IT sector and millennials, it does matter. So it's the first study of broadband adoption in metros, and in a way it's consistent with this story about how technology investment does matter in this kind of diverging fortunes. But it gives us some insights onto how we might build inclusive growth and inclusive innovation. It says that human capital strategies like broadband adoption, that they matter too for economic outcomes. Not just the development of the IT industry and not just millennials in the workforce in the region. So this is something that economic development practitioners and local officials need to pay attention to for prosperity in their community and even for growth in combination with some of these other factors. So we looked at the county level too. And while broadband adoption in this earlier study benefited rural counties, does it matter for others too, especially now that we have this more precise data? Looking over time again, since 2000, for the 320 largest counties, again, this is data from this portal, we looked at whether it matters for median income. We'll be looking at some other things later. This is being developed. So in the time series models, you see this line goes up to the right, the answer is yes, it does matter. As broadband, what this tells you is that broadband is a significant predictor of county median income. And while these are the 320 largest counties, some of them are quite rural, like in the West. They might be big enough because of a big geographic size, even if they're very rural. We can see, and this combines urban and rural counties, this lagged effect models. Again, we're controlling for things like population size, race, ethnicity, the share of college educated or high school educated in the population. And broadband predicts higher levels of median income in these counties over time. So just really quickly, because this is one single point in time, this ACS data that came out 2017, it's really an average, 5-year average. We looked at this data at the county level, and you don't know from one point in time what's causing what, but we just wanted to look quickly, is this, if we look at all the counties, because we only had 320 in the others, if we look at all the counties, do we see any relationships with measures of prosperity, with health rankings, with things like voter turnout, because greater access to information could lead to some of these other community outcomes. So in this one, we used, you can look it up. There's a group called the Economic Innovation Group. They have a Distressed Communities Index, but at the top of it, the communities that are higher on this, they see as more prosperous, and they're looking at poverty rates and median income and adults working, change in employment, change in establishments. So some of the things in the other prosperity index. But we can look at this at the county level. And, so you can see we mapped the prosperity index, the health rankings, voter turnout. I won't dwell on this for time, but they look different. The geographic patterns aren't the same across these three outcomes. And we see that broadband subscriptions, we left out cell phones here, are significant predictors, they're positive predictors for all of these things. Broadband adoption in 2017 for prosperity, health, and voter turnout. And we included the usual controls that we've included in the other models. The problem is it's 1 year in time, so we know they're related, but we can't make that argument about causation for these. We're going to work on doing some time series models with, for things like health and voter turnout, for other outcomes, for counties where we do have the data over time, but we thought it was useful to hold up against this. If we look at all counties, do we see any relationship or not? And the answer is yes. So as this suggests, we're continuing our work on this. It's not a finished product, but we have a book that we hope will be coming out next year. And of course, we'll let NDIA know. What we've found from this is with this new data on broadband adoption, we're able to look at use rather than only infrastructure. We can see strong relationships for things like prosperity and metros, some for growth. Although it's higher in some communities, IT does matter too in the IT industry. We can see it's a significant predictor of median income for large counties over time. And, these other results suggest that it's worth digging into some of the other outcomes too. In the book, we'll look at these different geographic scales, cities and neighborhoods to some extent too. It expands on some of the work that's been done before by colleagues on infrastructure or the rural work by Whitaker et al., some of the business research. But what this really gives us more solidly than before is evidence that digital citizenship, that digital inclusion truly does matter for communities. 2 questions. And I think people are coming around with the microphones. So if you have a question, the microphone will help me hear you.
Got you. Gerard, I got you.
Thank you, sir. Okay, thank you. We'll do that. Welcome to Charlotte. My name is Gerard. I work with the Housing Partnership. My question to you was, in the spirit of digital inclusion, can you share any research that you all did about including the displacement of natives that take place in some of the metro regions that increase their prosperity? As the IT employment increases with millennials, could you just comment towards?
Oh, like gentrification?
Yeah. So I'll put the G word out there.
It's an okay word. It's not 4 letters. No. The short answer to that is no. We've done some other work where we've looked at, so some of the work I did in Chicago on the Smart Communities program, we controlled for demographic change in the neighborhoods over time. Some of those neighborhoods were gentrifying. It's an important issue if you're looking at outcomes, but it's, I guess I'm not sure that there's always, well, some of the demographic data, if we look at the demographic change over time, that could get at that. So maybe as we're writing up these final results, that's something that would be interesting to look at. We do know from our prior research that in some cities that the gaps for technology use between different racial and ethnic groups are much narrower in some cities. That's generally where there are high rates of adoption, like Portland and Seattle, for everyone. And that's something I wanted to dig into a little in this book, but we haven't gotten to that chapter yet. So, good suggestion. Thanks.
Last question. Bruce, can you get the person all the way back there?
Thank you. Lou Tobias from the city of Rochester. One of the things that I noticed on one of the EIG slides was that there were very few what I would call old guard cities in the East. New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, sort of what they call the Rust Belt cities in the high-ranked prosperity index. Does anything related to things like the age of infrastructure be a driver in that outcome, i.e., you're not going to be able to run fiber down Broadway in New York City, and you may be able to do it somewhere else. And I'm wondering whether or not those kinds of variables can be either controlled for or showed up in the data anywhere.
Actually, in some other presentations, I had their maps, and you can see the most distressed and the most prosperous. And there are regional patterns to this. I think it's a reflection of more economic New York doesn't have economic disinvestment. So, I'm not sure. I've seen the maps, but they don't measure infrastructure. You can see what they're measuring here. Some of the work that Chetty has shown is that actually in some of the large cities like New York, opportunity is more limited than in other less populated areas. So that might, this index might reflect some of those measures. I'm not sure though. I haven't done the EIG index. This is just something we're going to look at for possible outcome measures, but these are mostly things in the census tract on poverty rates, median income ratio and that. So these things may go together, but it's not something that's measured in the index.
Since we're over schedule, we're going to give Karen a big round of applause.